I am the resurrection and the life. They who believe in me, though they die, yet shall they live. And whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. I read this passage yesterday at the funeral. I read it at every funeral and memorial service. These words of Jesus as spoken to Martha are the ones that are central to what we believe. The church clings to these words like no others. The scene of Jesus with the two grieving sisters weeping at the grave of their brother has offered comfort and hope by unmatched by any other. But there's more to this story here. John's account of the raising of Lazarus is one of several sign stories in his gospel. The stories tend to be longish and complete in themselves, with many details of who said what, often with just one small verse or two of actual action. And then Jesus' words of interpretation, the various reactions of the people involved and the crowd around, along with substantial theological reflection on the meaning of what has happened. We saw this last week with the story of Jesus healing the man born blind, and the stories of Jesus turning water into wine at Cana and feeding the multitudes are also other examples in the Gospel of John. These are meant not only to tell what Jesus did or said as something in the past, but that they continue to mean something, are alive in the present, in our present. And there are a number of common features to these stories, and two of them are Jesus acts according to his own time and not according to external pressures. For example, Jesus distances himself from his mother before changing the water into wine at Cana. Remember, she's the one who asks him to do it, and he pushes her away before he does it. In our story today, Jesus waits 2 days before responding to the news that his friend Lazarus is very ill. Jesus acts in the world on his own time, with his own timing, according to the plan of God, and not according to what might be happening on the ground. And second, to say this is a sign story means that its primary function is revelation. Some truth about God is revealed through what happens in the story. So there's two levels to these. On one, Jesus does what he does. He heals, he feeds, he raises the dead. But on another level, he shows us something about himself, something about God and about ourselves. We're told at the beginning of the raising of Lazarus the purpose, not only for the glory of God, but that the Son of God may be glorified by means of it. In other words, the raising of Lazarus will cause the Son's return to God by means of his death and resurrection. In this way, we, the readers, are alerted to something that the people in the story right there at Bethany don't know. That what's going on here is not only a family crisis in Bethany in the first century, but the crisis of the world. Not only the raising of a dead man, but the giving of life to the world. It's about the death and resurrection of Lazarus, but more importantly, it's about the death and resurrection of Jesus. The sisters want their brother back, for sure. But Jesus is also acting to give life to the world. As he says to Martha, I am the resurrection and the life. But Mary and Martha and Lazarus aren't just props to prove a point. They're real people trapped in death and grief. And Jesus brings them comfort and life. He was a real person ministering among friends and strangers. But John wants us to understand that God's blessing didn't come only to certain people who happened to be in that place at that time. There was not one place and time, a sort of Camelot, where cripples are healed, the blind could see, and the dead were raised. It's not the case that subsequent generations in other times and places would have to be satisfied with a thin diet of reading and remembering the good old days when Jesus was here and said, I am the resurrection and the life. Although we were not there, Jesus also said, have you believed because you've seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen seen and yet believe. Faith is always a first-generation thing, a right-now thing, with an immediacy about it that doesn't distinguish between our being there and Jesus being here. This question of time, the present and the past, and the relationship between the present and the past is key to what John is trying to explain, what he's demonstrating here. Remember, Jesus arrives at Bethany after a 2-day delay, and Martha, whose brother has died in the course of the 2 days, says to Jesus, "If you'd been here, Lazarus would not have died." And Jesus assures her, "Your brother will rise again." And Martha responds with the standard response of faith. She knows that he will rise on the last day, meaning the likely very distant future when God brings the Messiah and the kingdom will come. That's the day of resurrection she's thinking of. But Jesus makes the conversation not only about that distant future that she's thinking of, but about the immediate and concrete present, because he says, "I am the resurrection," he says, "and the life." In other words, the resurrection has to do not only with that distant future, but right here and now in Bethany, right here and now in Meyersville, and not just a far away and maybe not for sure future. Lazarus being called from the grave and coming out is a bold reminder of God's power to transform not only Lazarus and his life and the life of his sisters, but our lives today. When in our lives we're overburdened, we feel pressed down, pulled apart, can we live again? Can we see beyond what is in our own control? Can we get over the anger we feel toward God, who sometimes seems not here? This story from John boldly reminds us that Jesus was in control of what we would think of as an uncontrollable situation. Those gathered around the grave, gathered there with Mary and Martha in their house, they didn't see any possibilities. They saw no hope. But Jesus shattered the barriers between Lazarus and a new day, not only for Lazarus and his sisters, but for that crowd watching and waiting, for we who wait and watch. We're challenged to set our goals on what God can do through us, the difference in what we are and what we might be. We envision a better world. Because Jesus is with us in the present, we have the power and can envision a better world, the one he calls us to enable and to help to bring forth. And Weems wrote about in a poem, Reaching for the Rainbow, she says, "I keep reaching for the rainbows, thinking one morning the hungry will be fed, the dying held, the maimed walking, the angry stoked, the violent stroked, the oppressed freed, the oppressors chained, and every tear wiped away." The resurrection has happened, but it's not all finished yet. Michelangelo left many of his statues unfinished on purpose. One of them shows a man with his arm and legs protruding out of this massive block of granite, but the rest of him is hardly formed, it's just roughly chiseled. Perhaps Michelangelo wanted to remind us, like those statues, that we're all unfinished products. We're like Lazarus, being called to a new day even when the situation seems hopeless. We can trust in Jesus, maybe not on our own time schedule, but on his. And in the meantime, we're called to participate. We're called to become part of the realization, the making real of the maimed walking, the oppressed freed, the oppressors changed, the tears wiped away. Remember when Jesus calls Lazarus out of the tomb, he tells the others there, the crowd waiting around too, he says, "Unbind him and let him go." The community is commanded to participate in God's action, to bring it to its desired end, to join in, to take part in God's redemption. We can live in a new way when we're both aware that Jesus is present with us today in our present, and we can trust our lives with his guidance. Will Willimon, in his book Resident Aliens, Life of the Christian Colony, wrote that this story demands an offensive rather than a defensive posture by the church. The world and all its resources, anguish, gifts, and groaning, this is God's world, and God commands what God has created. Jesus Christ is the supreme act of God's intrusion into the world, sort of settled and arranged existence. In Christ, God refuses to stay far away in God's place somewhere else. We claim from this story the power of Jesus to call us out from wherever it is that we are buried, whether it's in fear or pain or grief or worry or just pressure. Edwin Marshman wrote, "Did he call Lazarus from death's abyss? Did he change water into wine that day? Yes, but his greatest miracle is this, to make a Christian from our common clay." Time means nothing to God's purposes, whether it's Jesus' 2-day delay or the difference between back then in Bethany and now. The time doesn't matter. We're challenged to believe that it's never too late to allow our dreams, to hope, to live again, to respond as Lazarus, and to come forth to live. From the Psalm, "I wait for the Lord, my soul waits for the Lord more than those who watch for the morning. O Israel, hope in the Lord, for with the Lord there is steadfast love, and with him is great power to redeem." Like Lazarus, we're called to come forth, to live. Like the waiting crowd, we're called to unbind and let go those who are suffering, who are bound up, who are frightened. It is our hope and our faith that whatever the time, then, now, future, wherever the place, it is the right time for Jesus to be with us. Let us pray. Loving God, comfort all who grieve this day. Help us to be faithful